Good morning, Mary. Nobody down yet? I'll just glance over the paper until someone else comes.
Here it is, ma'am.
The usual sensational headings. Typhoid epidemic threatened. Shocking. Fortunately, it's not in our part of town. Mary, be sure to serve only bottled spring water. For the family, I mean, of course.
Yes, ma'am.
Another strike. I never read about those silly labor troubles. Demand for better public schools. That doesn't interest me. Fortunately, we've always been able to send the children to private schools. Suffragists hope for victory at the polls today. Well, they certainly will be disappointed. After the magnificent speeches made by our anti-suffragist leaders last week, the Yellow Peril, as our dear president so beautifully names the movement, is trampled underfoot.
Good morning, Mother.
Good morning, darling. How rosy you are this morning.
Votes for women. Oh, Mother, one of our teachers wore a pen with that on it, and I asked her why she didn't have a Votes for Monkeys pen, too.
An excellent question, Dick. What did she say?
Well,
Why don't you pull up my chair for me? Don't you know that a gentleman always shows respect for ladies?
Say, Mother, honestly, don't you wish you could vote today?
No, indeed. I am quite willing to put all my political burdens upon my husband's shoulders.
Good morning, Mother.
Good morning, dear.
I was just saying, my dear, that I am so glad to lay all my political burdens upon your strong shoulders.
Very nice of you, my love. May I have my coffee right away? I've just time to catch my train to the country club.
It's fortunate that we have such fine weather for Election Day, isn't it, Father? They say it makes such a difference.
Yes, indeed. The links will be crowded.
I was thinking of the polls. You know you will have to bear my political burdens too today, Father, since I am 21.
When I'm 21, I'll bear my own burdens. You won't have to worry about me, Dad. Girls haven't enough sense to vote, poor things.
Don't be rude to your sister. You won't vote until late this afternoon, I suppose.
I'm afraid I can't manage to pull off a vote today. The committee on golf is going to stay at the country club to dine. There are some highly important matters to decide, and I shall not get back into town until late this evening.
Oh, I'm sorry, dear. I did want you to vote against the women's suffrage amendment.
I think that I wanted you to vote in favor of it, Father.
Dorothy, I'm surprised at you.
Well, I wish you women would attend to your own politics. I'm going to play golf. I refuse to have the burden of the vote thrust upon me against my will. Goodbye. Don't wait up for me.
Now, who is to represent us at the polls today, Mother? Father's playing golf, Jim is away, and Dick is not of age.
Tom Randolph would represent you if you would only accept him. As for me, I must use indirect influence somehow. Dick, go to school at once or you'll be late.
Goodbye, Mother. Goodbye, Dorothy.
I think I'll go out, Mother. I want to take some books to the hospital.
My dear, you can't go over in that part of town on election day. When I was a girl, ladies never went out at all on election day. There were always so many drunken men.
But I promised to leave the books today, Mother.
Oh, very well. Mary can take them over this evening when she has finished her work. It will be a nice little outing for you, Mary.
But Mother, Mary is younger than I am, and surely the streets will be more dangerous after dark.
If Mary behaves herself properly, she will be perfectly safe. Pray, what are the police for?
Very well, ma'am.
Darling, I wish that you had heard my anti-suffrage speech yesterday. I flatter myself that some of the phrases were very telling. In one place I said, "Why turn the sewer of American politics into the sanctity of the home?"
What does that mean, Mother? Is it an argument?
No, my child. We have no arguments, but we know that we are right. Women have such wonderful intuition about right and wrong.
Wouldn't that intuition be helpful in politics?
Whoever heard of intuition in a sewer? By the way, speaking of politics, we must give a dinner to Senator Grant in the holidays. It is most important to get him interested in Jim's appointment to West Point. I do want one of my dear sons to serve his beloved country.
Can one serve it only by fighting?
What foolish questions you ask, Dorothy. You must have formed the habit at college.
I'm sorry that I was tiresome, Mother. Tell me something more about your meeting.
Well, one of the speakers was a man, very distinguished in his profession. He told us wonderful truth. He said that no woman is ever born a suffragist.
How does he know? New babies can't talk.
Oh, he is very clever about statistics, and all those things about being born come under the head of statistics, of course. He said, too, that if we should get women's suffrage, the state would relapse into barbarism.
Surely he was joking.
Not at all. He was most serious, and it made us all feel very sad. I wish that your Aunt Madeline could have heard him. She is always so cheerful.
I'm afraid that Aunt Madeline is the exception, for she is sure she is a born suffragist.
Mrs. Lewis has arrived, ma'am.
are you today, sister? I was afraid that you would be too busy to drop in this morning.
My turn as watcher at the polls comes later. Everything's going splendidly, and I feel I can give myself an hour's rest.
You suffragists have wonderful energy. Now, I feel quite exhausted after my speech of yesterday.
I don't wonder, dear, after what I've heard of it.
But how can one give one's strength better than defending the sacred traditions of home?
Women's enfranchisement will be a sacred tradition of home for future generations.
Madeline, I admit that you and I might use enfranchisement well, but how would you like your cook to vote?
He does.
How stupid of me. I forgot that you have a chef now. Well, consider then what it would mean to enfranchise an ignorant woman, like Kate Connor, the washerwoman, for instance.
Please, Mrs. Gardner, may Kate speak to you for a moment?
I suppose so. Send her in.
Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, Miss Dorothy. Oh, good morning, Mrs. Lewis. Was last week's wash all right, ma'am? Miss Polly's nightgown is pretty enough to wear outside. I always tell my girls. It was about the laundry stove I wanted to speak a word. Since the stove man put it in perfect order, I can do nothing with it at all.
I'm sorry, Katie, but I don't think we could get anyone to look at it today, on account of its being election day, you know.
I suppose so, ma'am. The men act as if it took 'em all day to vote. Anything for a holiday, I'm thinking. Well, I'll just have patience with the stove, and maybe the cook will give me a fling at the range.
Oh, one moment, Katie. When you came in, Mrs. Lewis and I were talking about women's suffrage. You know what that means, I suppose?
Yes, ma'am. I often hear my girls talking about it with their friends.
Of course, you would take no interest in enfranchisement. You have, I suppose, no education?
Awful little, ma'am. My girls could do better with their books when they was 10 years old than myself at any age. When I was young, it was terrible hard for the poor to get any schooling. My mother, God rest her soul, was always saying I had no need of education. I had so much sense. You know, the way mothers do be talking about their own.
I see. You acknowledge, then, that you are illiterate. I suppose that you never even heard of the tariff, for instance?
Indeed, I have, ma'am. That's what they talk about at the store when they do be asking a fancy price for their things. Sure, somebody ought to keep an eye on it, for it's cruel hard on the poor when it gets to the going on so.
Of course, you have no ideas at all about finance.
No, ma'am, none of my aunts were ever fine at all. Just poor people like myself.
Not finance, Katie, but finance. That means banking and that sort of thing.
Ah, this savings bank you're meaning. All that a poor woman like me knows is to put her bit of money in it, and then pray to God on her bended knees that it won't bust up on her.
Then have you ever heard of civil service reform?
Civil servants reform, is it? I'm thinking it would be best to reform all that ain't civil. The butlers now, some of them, be giving themselves the airs of the blessed Holy Father himself.
You see, Madeline, she does not even know the meaning of the names of these important issues.
If they'd be asking me such hard questions on election day, I'd have no luck at all with my voting. I'd better go back to my tubs I had and not be showing my ignorance to you ladies.
Wait, Katie. If you had the vote, is there anything that you would care to help about? Anything that especially concerns you and your neighbors? The other women, I mean.
That concerns us women? We're alike, rich and poor. I'm thinking in what lies nearest to our hearts. We want to keep our husbands working steady and have decent food and shelter that don't cost too dear, and give our children a better chance than we had ourselves.
Your own husband is dead, is he not?
That he's not, ma'am. He's just across the river, in the next state, enjoying himself. He left me when my baby was a week old, and there were 3 other children to look to.
Why didn't you have him arrested and brought back?
Sure, I said to John Kelly, the officer on our block, great friend of my husband's he was. I says to him, "It's an arm of the law you call yourself, John Kelly. Can't you get the body of it to slip across the line and fetch Mike back to his children? For it's near starving we are."
What did he say?
"I'm sorry for you all, Mrs. Connor. Indeed I am," he says. "But the law can't fetch Mike back to the state, for it's just a misdemeanor, his leaving you. It is. Sure, if you'd have us chase after all the deserting husbands that clear out of state, we'd have no time to catch the real important criminals, and the expense would be terrible," he says. "And that's a thing you women don't consider."
What did you say to him, Katie?
What's the law for, John Kelly? I asked him. If it's not to protect the helpless and innocent and keeping 'em from being a public charge. You don't understand the matters of state, he says. Go home and mind your baby. My baby is dead. They do die most ways when their mothers are starving, I says, and I am working my fingers to the bone to keep the others alive while their father's but a few miles away earning good money and spending it to get some other poor girl into trouble.
Poor Katie. How did you manage to get along?
Well, I got my washing and cleaning to do, and you don't have to buy awful much food when there's no man to feed. Then, when my Annie got old enough, she went into the mill and helped me keep the others. She's a good girl, but delicate-like.
It's only the lazy poor that don't get on.
Maybe, but I think there's such a thing as too hard work for the young. Many a night Annie would come home crying with her poor back and sore feet after the 12 hours of standing in rush times, with what small pay and the fines, in the weeks the girls get laid off between seasons. It's more than laziness that keeps them from getting rich. Many a one has slept on my kitchen floor when there was no other place for her to go but the street, and you know what that means.
I've been told that an honest, industrious girl could always find work.
Maybe so, ma'am, but you may be thankful that your own is safe at home with her piano, and not out in the cold with a sore heart looking for a job and some devil a-following her up.
Really, Katie, you must not use such language.
You must excuse me, ma'am, but you asked me like. I'll go back to my wash now, or I'll not have a rag out on the line before midday.
Katie, I believe that if we women get the vote, that you and your neighbors will help us to understand your troubles and try to improve conditions for women and children.
I am ignorant. Indeed, Mrs. Gardner has a right to be sayin'. But as for knowing about husbands that beat you up and leave you, and boys that get led away in saloons and gambling places, and the tenements where babies die like flowers that have no water, and the young girls that go to the bad because they're cold and hungry, why, I understand all that as you'd understand a tea party. I'd be dumb enough if I didn't, when I live in the midst of it. My girls aren't ignorant like me. My Maggie's in high school, she is. And she's going through it if I have to work till I drop to keep her there. She's going to have her chance.
Well, Genevieve, the illiterate woman isn't such a bugaboo as you antis picture her.
Katie really has unusual intelligence for a woman in her position. And she's an excellent laundress, too. I don't know whether I approve of her sending her youngest to the high school. She'd much better go out to service. Still, one must help the poor. I shall give Katie her car fare after this. She often stays after hours when the wash is very large. Dorothy, you might send her girls that blue hat of yours that is so hideously unbecoming, and your black muff that the moths got into last summer.
Mother, dear, I think I'd rather send them something really pretty and new.
That's very generous of you, darling, but you'd better send the muff, too, for after the moths have once been in a thing, I'm glad to get it out of the house.
I must take my turn as a watcher now. Goodbye, Genevieve. Goodbye, Dorothy.
I wish I could go with you, Aunt Madeline. I really am a suffragist at heart.
Dorothy, you astonish me. You know how conservative Tom Randolph is. If you mix yourself up in this unfeminine movement, his feeling for you will surely change.
Then let it change. I've been promised to marry him, and I never will marry any man who looks upon a wedding ring as a muzzle.
Now you see, Madeline, what your example has done. Tom Randolph is the most desirable young man in our set.
Excuse me, Mr. Randolph is here, ma'am.
Good morning, Mrs. Gardner. Morning, Mrs. Lewis. And an awfully lovely morning to you, Dorothy. Awfully early for a visit, I'm afraid. I suppose you are fearfully busy with housekeeping and all that.
Oh, not at all. We're always delighted to see you. Do sit down and tell us the news from the great masculine world.
Well, really, it's rather early in the day for news. I've just come back from the polls, and it was rather jolly there. An awfully pretty girl gave me this pen. See? Votes for woman.
How exceedingly forward in her. It was very kind in you to take it, I'm sure.
Oh, really, Mrs. Gardner? She wasn't forward at all. She had the manners of a princess, and she handed this to me like it was a cotillion favor, and I just said thanks awfully. Then she said, put it on, please, and vote for the suffrage amendment. So I did.
Oh, I'm so glad, Tom.
But you've always talked against women's suffrage, Tom.
Just sentiment, Mrs. Gardner. I'm so jolly sentimental I've never reasoned about it. I just thought I wouldn't want my wife to talk politics to me. Because I've always been rather stupid about them, and I wouldn't want my wife to know just what an ass I am. But she'll probably find out anyway.
You're too modest, Mr. Randolph. Let me thank you for your support.
Not at all, Mrs. Lewis. Don't mention it. Always a pleasure to do anything for you. Besides, I was jolly glad to be on the other side from the gang that have been working against the amendment. I've never saw a tougher lot in my life. Of course I don't mean you, Mrs. Gardner, but the men who are opposed to it. Most of them want a wide open town all the time. While I was waiting for my turn, I saw Sykes, the chap who keeps the worst saloon in the ward, talking to a policy shop friend of his. Then there was Smith, the man the Consumers League is always getting after, and that chap Jones that fights against child labor reform. They weren't wearing any votes for women pins. Not they. I was rather proud of mine when I saw how those fellows glared at it.
But the sanctity of the home, Tom.
Well, I guess the home's all right with the right woman in it. Perhaps next year I'll go to the polls with my wife. Now, wouldn't that be jolly? What do you think, Dorothy?
I think it'd be rather nice.
Yes, I'm sure that next year the polls will look like Noah's Ark with all the couples approaching. And how will you feel then, Genevieve?
They shan't tease you, Mother, if it happens. We'll just slip out quietly and vote and not bother you about it.
Not bother me about it? Do you suppose that if you other women vote, I shall stay at home doing nothing? I think that I know what I want as well as anyone, and if I can't get it any other way, I'll just go and vote for it.
Mother.
Hurrah then for next election day. I'll meet you at the polls then, Mrs. Gardner.
Let me see. I think that about 3 o'clock in the afternoon would probably be the nicest time at the polls.
Oh,
Oh,
Mother.
Genevieve.
Wonderful.